Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining H2 Hazard Mitigation Policy. We have a great lineup here on presentations that hit on two important topics, acquisitions or buyouts, and also the size and scope of the severe repetitive loss property problem and the implications that both of those topics have for policymakers. To start us off will be Laura Marshall, who's giving a presentation on effectiveness and equity considerations of buyout programs. Specifically looking at the Johnson Creek Willing Seller Program assessment. Laura Marshall is a project manager with ECONorthwest, an economics consulting firm headquartered in Portland, Oregon. She holds a dual master's degree from Oregon State in applied economics and water resource policy and management, and specializes in natural resource economics, benefit cost analysis, and economic impact analysis. Please ask questions as you watch her presentation, and then we'll get to them at the end of her presentation. Enjoy.
Hello, my name is Laura Marshall. Welcome to session H2. This is the Johnson Creek Willing Seller Program Assessment and evaluation of effectiveness and equity considerations of a buyout program. And so to begin, let me give you an overview of the Johnson Creek Willing Seller Program. So this is a program that has been around formally since 1997, although there were acquisitions happening as early as 1992 in this area by the city. It's administered by the city of Portland, Oregon, the Bureau of Environmental Services. And it's funded at about $1.4 million per year through the Capital Improvement Program bond for sewers and stormwaters. And to date, they've acquired about 180 properties, over 275 acres, and they will acquire properties whenever there are opportunities to do so. They send an annual letter, and once they hit critical mass for the projects that they're envisioning, then they assemble the properties together to create the restoration projects. And so they can be pretty darn patient. Another thing I'll say that distinguishes this program perhaps from others is it is absolutely with the goal of reducing flood risk for property owners and homeowners in the floodplain, but it also has a very intentional environmental goals. So there's Endangered Species Act listed salmon in this area, for example. And so the Bureau of Environmental Services is also there very much for restoration. So they will absolutely acquire properties that do not have homes on them, because it's not just the flood risk, it's the restoration potential as well that they're interested in. So to give you an idea of the area that we're talking about, this is in Southeast Portland, and the Johnson Creek watershed Johnson Creek is a tributary to the Willamette River. And it's 55 square miles, so not incredibly large. And it's urban as you get closer to the Willamette River. So on the west side there is where it's more urban versus on the east, getting more rural. And to give you a sense of the type of flooding that we're talking about, the type of acquisitions and homes that we're talking about, here's a picture that the Bureau of Environmental Services provided me. And so this is reoccurring persistent flooding, not one big large event, but flooding that happens every couple of years, perhaps not to this extent every year. And the type of home that we're talking about are things like this in this area. And this is one of the more rural area components. So to give you a sense of the acquisitions, the blue line here is the acquired parcels over time. Yellow is the number of acres. So those generally correlate pretty strongly, but you can see there's some big deviations in some years. And so the story to tell from this graph, and it only goes to 2019, but 2020 is similar, is that acquisitions are going down, both in quantity and the number of acres being acquired. And so this is one of the reasons that motivated this study in part was to look at ways to potentially increase participation in the program, seeing these declines. And the narrative around it is potentially that a lot of the low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better term, has already been acquired. And so now that the properties are becoming a little bit more difficult to acquire, how can the Bureau be looking at ways to do that in an equitable fashion as well? And so those motivate our study questions here. So I am not a floodplain manager. I do not work for the Bureau of Environmental Services. I am an economist by training, and So my firm, ECONorthwest, as well as our subconsultant, Bonnie G. Yosik, was brought in for this project to do a broad program evaluation. And to be honest with you, there are quite a few elements to that program evaluation, not all of which I have time to talk about today. And so focusing in on these three questions here, which were components of it. The first is based upon the notion that a barrier to participation in the program is the outcome that particularly residential owner occupiers of these parcels, of which there are many, are experiencing. So are they able specifically to experience adequate replacement housing? So we'll talk about that first. Next is, okay, well, maybe it's challenging to purchase the full property and the home, and there are considerations with that because you're taking housing out of the housing supply in a very housing constrained market. And so are there opportunities to expand the use of partial acquisitions in that case? So we're only acquiring a portion of the property. And so that's something we evaluated explicitly as well. Lastly, if there are BES practices that could better address the concerns of the most at-risk vulnerable sellers and what those concerns are. So for the first question related to the homeowners and owner residents' ability to secure adequate replacement housing, we're very intentionally using the term adequate there. And so by adequate, we mean the HUD definition of decent, safe, sanitary, and in good repair. And decent, safe, and sanitary in itself refers to meeting local housing and occupancy codes. It's an appropriate size for the number of occupants and is free of any barriers for a person with disability. And for the people that we've been working closely with at the Bureau of Environmental Services, the appropriate size for the number of occupants is a key component of decent, safe, and sanitary. They have quite a few instances where they have fairly low income residents living with multiple generations. So something like 5 people in a 2-bedroom house, things like that, where if they were to purchase that home, the seller's underwater and also be very challenging for them to move to somewhere that meets the adequate replacement housing definition here with decent, safe, and sanitary. And so first we did a comparison just to help BES understand where they are compared to this requirement. And so for the HUD voluntary standards, they are absolutely meeting those, if not exceeding in some cases. But the involuntary standards, where the adequate replacement housing definition comes in, is definitely viewed as a higher level and likely requiring higher compensation to identify those adequate replacement housing and provide compensation such that they can move there. And the other components like relocation assistance as part of that as well. And so we aren't suggesting that this is necessarily what the Bureau should do, but if they do want to increase participation and increase the likelihood that the people who are participating in the program are able to move to adequate replacement housing, this is definitely a consideration. And so research has already been done, not to address that question specifically about adequate replacement housing, but to understand what is the impact of being in the floodplain on these homeowners that's reflected in the appraisal and therefore the offer that they're getting from the Bureau for acquiring the property. And so this is research by a professor and others in the Portland area. And they specifically did a study on the Johnson Creek program area and looking at the difference in property values for properties with both a building in the floodplain as well as just a portion of the property in the floodplain, but not a building. And so you'll see here that if there's a building in the floodplain, the properties sell on average for 21.5% less, which is fairly darn significant, especially when you think about what that can buy you in comparable housing. And 8.6 if the building's not in the floodplain, but the property intersects it. And so with that in mind and these concerns from the Bureau, what we did is an analysis of, we call them the candidate parcels. And so these are the single family residential parcels that are likely to be acquired in the future. We worked with the Bureau to define those. And so this is where it's kind of complicated because we don't know what adequate replacement housing is because we don't know every individual housing characteristic. Similarly, we don't know what they're looking for. There might be folks who are retiring and deciding that they want to downsize. Or there might be folks whose families are growing and they want to upsize. And so absent knowing that, this is a course analysis just to inform the policy. And so what we did was we compared properties for those 197 homes on 3 dimensions, and we compared them to other properties in the area. So we used the 2 counties that this the Johnson Creek Williams Seller program is in, Multnomah and Clackamas County. So we use those 2 counties as, okay, if they want to stay generally in the same area where they're at now, if they want to be about the same lot size, about the same building size, and it's going to be for about the same sale price, what does that get them? And we used a machine learning algorithm, really just a regression. And this was colleagues on my team, not me myself, so please don't ask too much about it. But essentially controlling for those variables, how important is each of them, and what happens when you change them. And so to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, here are the Johnson Creek candidate parcels outlined in red at the bottom. And so you can see how they compare, not the properties themselves, but the area that they're in. So this is the Portland is in dark blue, essentially. The more urban areas are the smaller tax lots, so the smaller sized lots. And we chose 0.45 acres just because that's the median of the properties that are the candidate parcels. And so to do our modeling, we have baseline conditions. So where are comparable homes on those dimensions within those 2 counties? And then we pulled levers. So what happens, how many more properties could they potentially buy if you increase purchase price, if you decrease building area, if you decrease parcel area? And what we realized pretty early on in this is that we had to separate it out for larger and smaller homes because their size of the property matters quite a bit based on lot size. Oops. And so what we did, type 1 is the smaller properties. What we did is we divided every single parcel and we combined them into the census block groups. And with those, we looked at the percent of parcels within that block group that the potential seller could purchase based on those dimensions of price, building area, parcel area, and in those 2 counties. So takeaway from this map is that the lighter, the more yellow and less purple indicates that there are more areas where the seller can buy homes. And so what you see in the upper right corner, hopefully my face isn't obscuring it, is that really to get a dramatic change and dramatic increase in the number of properties available, you have to increase purchase price. It doesn't do much to have the seller change their preferences for building size, move smaller, move to a smaller home, move to a smaller lot. Really, it's the purchase price that makes a large difference. And same with the larger properties, although slightly more pronounced in the variation here of what they can purchase ahead of time. So they aren't going to find many things that are in the urban core at the same lot size, but outside of the lot size, they can. And so this is kind of our main result slide, and it's a little complicated, so bear with me for a little bit. Essentially, the numbers in red are the percent of parcels that the average comparable or the average potentially acquired in the future property by BES, the Bureau, how many other homes they can purchase. So for a smaller, under 0.45 acre lot, a type 1 property, in the baseline conditions, that seller on average is likely to be able to purchase 1.44% of homes are comparable. And so those are all homes within the 2 counties. Those are not adjusting for the amount of homes that actually might be for sale at any given time, which especially in a constrained market like this is going to be a small percentage of that. So 1% of 1%. And the takeaway from this really is that it is difficult for them to find comparable housing. And that is in part because of the purchase price and in part because of housing inventory. But the way to increase the likelihood and increase the amount of supply available to these sellers when they sell to the Bureau and participate in the Williams Seller program, increasing the potential locations that they can relocate to is most effectively done through increasing the paying price, and by 20% rather than 10% specifically. And so you can see for the type 1 properties, when you increase the paying price, all of a sudden you now have 5.6% of properties available that are comparable in that way. And so this is just showing really which lever is the strongest and its price effectively. So takeaways from this analysis, because the willing seller's property is valued lower than it would be if it were not in the floodplain, the purchase price may not be enough to purchase adequate, let alone comparable replacement housing in those nearby areas. And this is especially true for larger lots if they want to maintain a large lot because there's such low inventory of those, especially closer into the urban core. So moving on to our next question here. So there are definitely barriers to folks purchasing replacement housing. So what if instead the Bureau of Environmental Services wants to use partial acquisitions to acquire only portions of properties, particularly those larger properties? And are there opportunities to do that, and would sellers be interested in that? And if they're not interested, why not? And so the first question is, well, okay, why would the seller want to do this or not want to do this? And a major barrier to this is the fact that they are getting extremely low offers for their partial land. So one instance, we had an appraisal for an acre of land, waterfront, but due to zoning that limited the developability of the land, that acre was only valued at $25,000. And this is in the Portland housing market where the median housing price is $500,000. And if this was developable, it could be worth millions of dollars. Just my conjecture there. And so in addition to that, sellers might not like having the Bureau as a neighbor. There's going to be construction going on nearby. That might impact their property values in the short term. And they may not like how the property is managed. There's definitely issues of encampments out here and things that some of the neighbors don't like. And similarly, the administrative complexity timeline, some of this here in terms of especially the land division process can take many, many months. And so sellers may not want to be strung along for that amount of time for a partial acquisition that is only worth $25,000 for an acre. And so for this analysis, we didn't look at conservation easements because those are really difficult and vary case by case in terms of having a systematic approach to them. Instead, we looked at property line adjustments and land divisions. Also, conservation easements can theoretically be done anywhere, and so there's fewer barriers from an administrative perspective. Property line adjustments, PLAs, these have to be done where there's already existing publicly owned property, either by the Bureau of Environmental Services or another city. And with those, and you're adjusting the property line, there are 36 parcels out of the 190 or so that we had where this is possible. And so we assumed first property line adjustment will be done because it's administratively simpler and you can just absorb it into the existing land rather than the land division, which creates its own parcel. And so with the assumptions that we had here, basically that it's in an area that's has environmental benefits, the protection zone as a zoning that we use as a proxy for that, and minimum lot sizes in terms of they're not just going to acquire 10 square feet, we need a minimum. We applied those for the property line adjustments. And then for land divisions was everything that was left. And so the possible land divisions are areas where they meet requirements for zoning, so they have to be able to stand on their own, even though they're not going to be developed. The land division properties that you split them up into on their own need to meet setback requirements, frontage, utility access, that sort of thing. And so that's a challenge. And based on that, there's only really about 8 strong candidates. So the results of the partial acquisitions analysis are that this is probably not going to be a silver bullet for the Bureau. The majority of properties can't be acquired through either a property line adjustment or a land division. And the acreage is relatively small compared to the total area. So lastly, we wanted to look at equity and vulnerability. And this is something that's really important to the Bureau. And we talked about a little bit in the adequate replacement housing in terms of why it's something that they're concerned with, because they don't want to be a buyer of last resort for these people, really, and they want to be helping the community. And so we looked at a vulnerability analysis, and we ended up doing an index on two different variables of vulnerability. So vulnerability one, in that there are barriers to participation, so before they sell to the Bureau, and then vulnerability afterwards. So if there's potential for adverse outcomes. And this was informed by a literature review as well as informational interviews with realtors and folks who have been working in the program for a long time. And so the barriers to participation is an index based on these five variables, so things like disability, limited English, foreign-born, things that might impact their ability to navigate bureaucratic processes is the main theme here. Education levels as well. And so with this index, you get a pretty coarse measurement of where there might be barriers to participation. And the takeaway from this is essentially that there's potential that there are barriers. And we have a lot of qualms with using these census data because it's at a large scale like this. It doesn't tell you about your individual seller's situation. And that's one of the recommendations that we have, is that there's a more robust understanding of seller situations and ways to build in considerations to that in the compensation package that they're receiving. But overall, barriers to participation, increasing information accessibility is one of the main takeaways from this finding. Next, the potential vulnerability to having adverse outcomes. A main component of this is being able to deal with disruption and resiliency to a certain extent. And so having higher income is one way that helps with higher resiliency, potentially to moving and being able, again, to secure things like adequate replacement housing. Age also matters as well. There is a lot of literature on the value of aging in place and not moving out of your longstanding home. So we included that here too. And the results of this are similar to the last one, although at a smaller scale, interestingly. And so you can see the vulnerability. There are the census block groups, because it's at a smaller scale census block group rather than census tract. And you can see the candidate parcels here, many of which, again, are in areas that are potentially vulnerable, but this doesn't tell the full story with this data. And just as a note too, we included income, just so you can see the effect to which income is driving some of these results. And this is something that the Bureau was interested in seeing too. So findings from this are that there are opportunities to increase engagement and have direct communication with candidate parcel landowners because there are potentials for barriers. And likewise, there's potential for vulnerability, and combined with the results of the impact of being in the floodplain on the home value and the inability to secure comparable replacement housing, potentially based on that lower value, but also the lack of similar comparable properties overall means that there are very real barriers to participation in this program that the Bureau could address by potentially changing some of their practices related to information accessibility, compensation practices, accounting for sellers in unique situations, that sort of thing. So overall for this study, our findings are that the Johnson Creek Willing Seller Program is similar to other willing seller programs. We did a case study evaluation as part of this work that I didn't go into today that essentially said they're doing a good job, but they could be doing better, is a course takeaway that we have for the Bureau. And for the sellers, there absolutely may be barriers to selling in terms of securing adequate replacement housing. And a lot of that's probably driven by the price differentials because we do see that huge difference in a 20% change in the price allows you to purchase a lot more home that have similar characteristics. Alternative compensation methods could help increase the likelihood that sellers are able to secure adequate replacement housing as a result. And residents may be experiencing barriers to participation in addition, and may be vulnerable to adverse outcomes. And every situation is unique. That was another takeaway from this, that it really will vary depending on what the seller wants, what they need, what their individual situation is, both financially as well as personally, and their motivations to sell. Because the Bureau is not in a rush, they can wait a long time for homes to become available. The program is in a good place not to pressure people while also being a resource that's available, but they also recognize that their strategy is not accounting for all people in all situations. And to the extent that they can alter that to be more inclusive, potentially through partial acquisitions, which there might be ways to change some of the barriers associated with partial acquisitions, like the zoning, maintaining the zoning requirements, and how long the process takes, that might make it more attractive to both BES as well as sellers in the future. So with that, I'll end with my acknowledgements here and say thank you to everyone who's made it this far listening. Take care.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for that presentation. Gave us, I think, a lot to think about. Great to see a rigorous analysis that sort of confirms things that I think a lot of people feel in their gut, which is if you pay people more money to acquire their homes, more people will and can participate. We do have a few questions from the audience. The first is, has this program explored the idea of purchasing the property and then renting and or leasing it back to the previous property owner until alternative or replacement housing stock is available?
Yes. So to answer that question, it is actually something that the Bureau has done in the past. Part of our recommendations that we're actually working on now to finalize this project are the equity considerations of that, if you're offering it to some sellers and not other sellers, and just having a more systematic approach. But then obviously the trade-offs of that are that you don't have the flexibility and the tools needed in your toolkit to maybe incentivize and provide options for situations where sellers need it. So it definitely is something that they have done in the past, but again, not formalized.
So another person asked, what additional funding sources could help cover these higher property offers? Because recognizing even if there's federal grants available, many communities don't have or have a very limited budget for this kind of work.
Yeah, that's an interesting, and I think actually a distinction for the Johnson Creek Willing Seller Program, because it is not primarily funded by federal sources. They've tapped them over the program's history, but it's bond funded through essentially the public utilities fee for sewer and water. And so they, in a lot of ways, have quite a bit of funding year to year, pretty stable funding. And that's something I think they haven't looked into too much, because that the federal sources aren't actually a primary funding source for them.
Yeah, it's interesting how they have the different flexibility. So speaking about flexibility, is there flexibility in local land development regulations that might allow for smaller lot sizes, thereby helping facilitate that idea of partial sell-offs?
Yeah, this is one of our main recommendations for the partial acquisitions. And it's something interestingly the Bureau of Environmental Services could work with the Parks Bureau as well as other bureaus, because they'd be interested in this too. It's not just them who would benefit from the changed regulations that wouldn't require the same lot sizes and easements and utility access and emergency access for land that will never be developed. So it's something that they're pretty excited about, although nervous, I would say, as well, because it is this political ask essentially that they would need to coordinate on and would take a lot of staff time. And that's something with our recommendations, we're evaluating trade-offs in terms of equity, increases in participation, increases in staff time, and all these different components to think about for implementing these recommendations and what they're trying to achieve. But definitely something that there's some talk about.
Okay. So you talked about how the housing market in the area you were studying is fairly constrained. So we also talked about if you boost that purchase price by 20%, what does that actually equate to in dollars? Can you give us like a rough?
Ooh, yeah, you're going to challenge my math right now.
I know, right?
So if, let's say, medium household value here is about 500,000, so 20% of that would be 100,000 if my math is right. So that's significant, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not talking about a small amount of change here.
Yeah.
And some 20% may not be appropriate, and they might not be able to get that adopted. But something we were actually talking about in the green room before this on the per per square foot, average per square foot for the area. So just acknowledging that these properties are discounted to begin with and remedying that. But I would say for the recommendations that we've talked about with them, the thing that they're most excited about, and I think might have the biggest chance of actually happening, is changing to the HUD standard of adequate replacement housing. And so for people who would struggle to get adequate replacement housing based on the purchase price, having that available as an option and having relocation specialists work with them is something that there seems to be very real conversations about.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Mhm.
A couple more. So was there an evaluation at all as to why the flooding exists in this area in the first place? Is there some sort of, is there unrestricted overdevelopment upstream that's pushing the floodwaters down?
This is where I'm an economist and not a traditional hard scientist in that way, and I might struggle to answer this. But my understanding is it's just essentially like rain on snow events. This Mount Hood is a major mountain located upstream of this that can feed into it. And so essentially it is a rain-fed system, not
Yeah.
and in Oregon, the storms we get, it rains a lot, but we don't get those major hurricane type storms. So it's, I think I had that picture in there to show some of it. That's pretty extreme, frankly, from what we get normally.
So the next question is, are there or are the purchased or acquired parcels then deed restricted as open space, or what happens to them? Or what
Depends
happens?
on, yeah, for the partial acquisitions, what happens there. It depends on the type. So easements is something that we didn't evaluate from the analysis standpoint, but for the Bureau is a really interesting way. And frankly, they just have not been that aggressive in pursuing partial acquisitions. So easements might be something that answers a lot of these questions. And a benefit of those that's come up is the ability for the homeowner to still accrue what happens on the land, subject, of course, to the terms of the easement. But for example, houselessness and encampments are a big issue in this area. And so for the homeowner to still be able to enforce trespassing requirements is something that might make it more attractive to them, so they don't feel like they then run the risk of having encampments in their backyard.
Yeah, I could see that. Okay, so I think we have one more question. So definitely cost of housing seems to be inadequate, or cost of housing as an adequate replacement seems to maybe not be the only factor, but also maybe the location of the replacement housing relative to where the place of employment is. So a commuting issue. Could local government provide transportation assistance as an added option or incentive?
Ooh, that's interesting. We haven't talked about that too much. Potentially, the takeaway when we were presenting our findings to the Bureau and others is really the challenge with a program like this, because so much of it just varies on the individual seller situation. And you have some all across the board and all across the spectrum. And you heard me say this with the census data, that it's not fine enough of a skill to really tell about what's appropriate for an individual seller. But another recommendation is working with the other bureaus. There's a lot of tools that the city has in its tool belt. And so coordinating to answer questions like that, I think, is a great idea.
Yeah, that's a really interesting option. All right, well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation and a good Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, so next up we have Anna Weber from the Natural Resources Defense Council, who will talk about their interactive data visualization tool, Losing Ground. So Anna researches and advocates for policies that advance equitable adaptation to climate change as a member of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Water and Climate Team. The team works to incorporate the current and future effects of flooding, sea level rise, and other climate-driven hazards into local, state, and national decision-making to ensure that adaptation policies benefit those on the front lines of climate change. Prior to joining NRDC, Anna spent 10 years with the Cadmus Group, where she supported the US EPA. She also has a bachelor's degree in geology and a master's of public health. So let's see what she has to say.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning into this session. My name is Anna Weber. I'm a policy analyst at the Natural Resources Defense Council, specializing in flood risk and hazard mitigation policy. Today, I want to talk to you about mitigating the risk of severe repetitive loss properties under the National Flood Insurance Program. This is based on a data set that we obtained from FEMA, and we've posted it on our website, and we're excited to share it with you. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of a severe repetitive loss property. If not, this is a special designation under the National Flood Insurance Program meant to indicate the most flood-prone properties that are covered under the NFIP. Now, there are some nuances to this definition depending on how and when it's used, but for today's purposes, we're just talking about properties that are or have been covered under the NFIP and that have had 4 or more claims of $5,000 each, totaling over $20,000, or that have had 2 or more claims, but that add up to the value of the property. SRL, severe repetitive loss status, obviously has insurance implications, has implications for prioritization of hazard mitigation grant dollars, and it also sort of gives you a preview of the NFIP under climate change as flood risks increase and get more severe in many areas, and more people experience repetitive flooding in their homes over and over and over again. So as I mentioned, NRDC obtained a severe repetitive loss data set from FEMA. It's accurate as of mid-2018 and contains redacted but still property level data on 36,774 properties. Last September, we launched this publicly available interactive web tool that allows everyone to explore the data set. We're excited about this because due to privacy restrictions, it's historically been very difficult for the public to get access to severe repetitive loss data. So this is a big deal, and we're very pleased to be able to share this information with you. The web tool allows you to drill down by state and county to view the number of severe repetitive loss properties, some characteristics of those properties, like what flood zone they're mapped into, and whether they've seen any mitigation action to reduce their flood risk. And it's that last item that we're going to be talking about today. So here is a view of the national map in the tool. You can see the web address down at the bottom of the screen. You can go and explore it for yourself at any time. Orange dots here represent areas with lots of severe repetitive loss properties. The blue shading in the background is number of flood insurance claims. Actually, just for context, darker, brighter blue indicates more flood insurance claims, and lighter is fewer. So unsurprisingly, we see concentrations of severe repetitive loss properties near areas that have a lot of people and a lot of homes that have sustained major flood damage from big disasters in recent decades. So we see the Houston area, the New Orleans area, coastal New York and New Jersey, for example. So it's unsurprising if we just look over time at the number of severe repetitive loss properties that are on the books. We see that the numbers increase most rapidly in years that have big flood disasters. I've marked a few of them on the screen here. You can see a jump after Katrina, for example, and Sandy. But keep in mind, of course, that if a property meets the criteria to get on the severe repetitive loss list in, say, the hurricane season of 2016, it's probably had multiple other NFIP claims just by definition over the past few years, over the preceding few years, rather. It's just that last event puts it over the edge so that it meets the criteria for severe repetitive loss. These are the most flood-prone of the flood-prone properties in the flood insurance program. One thing that I think is particularly interesting about this data set is that it includes all of the properties that have ever met SRL criteria, regardless of whether that property has seen mitigation to reduce its risk, or even if it no longer exists. So here I've shaded the mitigated severe repetitive loss properties in light gray at the top. These are properties that are on record as having been elevated, bought out, so on and so forth. So we can think about them as sort of reducing the total number of properties by that much. And here the year is the date where we think a property has met the criteria to become severe repetitive loss. That's not necessarily the year that the mitigation action took place, but this is a way for us to sort of think about the fate of each of these properties. So this is not really a big proportion of the properties. It's less than a third. Another thing about this data set is that it also indicates the insurance status of each property record. So here I've shaded additional properties in dark gray if they are reported as not being mitigated, but also not being insured. So again, the properties in dark gray have not been mitigated, but according to this data set, they also no longer hold insurance. And that's a pretty sizable chunk of the properties overall. In fact, there are more of them, non-mitigated, uninsured severe repetitive loss properties, than there are mitigated properties. And that's not a great record. So not only is hazard mitigation not keeping pace with the most flood-prone properties in the flood insurance program, I mean, the overall numbers go up every year. Many of the people who live in these buildings are not even insured anymore, which of course can affect eligibility for grant funding, disaster aid, as well as just leaving people financially vulnerable to the floods that are probably still continuing at their homes. But I did say that we were going to talk about mitigated properties. So let's take a closer look at the properties that are shaded in orange on this graph, the one, sorry, light gray at the top that have received mitigation action. Some of you may be familiar with this reporting form, just an update on repetitive loss properties, just to show you how some of this data is collected. We're mostly concerned here with the two sections at the top, the one that says flood protection provided, and the one that says no building on property. So if we look overall across all of the properties in the data set, about 2/3 are recorded as not being mitigated, as we saw in the previous couple of slides. About 15% are reported as having no building on the property, and about 10% are recorded as having flood protection provided. Those last two categories, the ratio between them seems pretty reasonable to me. As we know, oftentimes it makes sense, both because of the resident's desire and also because of the exposure of the property to conduct a buyout and let the resident move elsewhere out of harm's way. So it makes sense that for these highly flood prone properties, the no building category might be a bit bigger. So let's look a little bit more closely at these specific categories. So actually, if we look at the no building on property category, it's about evenly split between properties that have been acquired and demolished through a program, so a FEMA or HUD-funded buyout project, for example, and those that were demolished but not acquired through any specific program. So this could include structures that were destroyed and just never rebuilt. The owner decided to demolish it on their own without government funding. There was a foreclosure, the owner walked away from the property, maybe. I mean, we can speculate. But one thing that I think is very interesting and also sobering is we can look in this data set at the funding sources for each of these mitigation actions. And particularly in this demolished but not acquired through a program category, we see indicators like disaster or fire instead of a funding source that we would expect, like FEMA or HUD or state money. And so from the perspective of the flood insurance program, the risk may be mitigated. There's no building there to sustain damage anymore, but it may not have worked out very well for the people who are responsible for that building and who had made their home there. So if we move down to the flood protection provided category, most of these received some form of elevation to or above the base flood. Not too surprising. That makes sense. A smaller number were replaced on site with a more resilient structure. This category does also include some non-residential structures, so there is sometimes flood proofing involved. And then we have a small number in this final category of other mitigation actions. Many of these are just actually marked as unable to locate. They're sort of lost to follow up. They may or may not be physically mitigated. The people who were living there may or may not be less exposed to risk. But again, from the perspective of the flood insurance program, there's no, money at stake because the property is, lost or dropped out. So these categories are relatively consistent over time. There's a bit of a jump, it looks like, in elevations around the mid 2000s, but otherwise the proportions are relatively steady. The numbers do look a bit like they plateau over the last few years covered by the data set. That's probably just an artifact of the amount of time that it takes to do mitigation projects. So as I'm sure you know, it is not instantaneous to get mitigation funding. Even after a large disaster. Some of you may be familiar with a report that we put out here at NRDC a couple of years ago on the long timeframes it takes for FEMA-funded buyouts in particular. So you can imagine, again, thinking about our hypothetical property that was damaged in the 2016 hurricane season, qualified to be severe repetitive loss. It's unlikely that they would have seen mitigation action by the time this data set was frozen in mid-2018. So that's not to say that it won't be mitigated. It's just not reflected in this data set at this time. So the data set also lets us take a geographic look at what's going on with these properties. Primarily, the records are organized by the NFIP participating communities, which makes sense. It's an NFIP data set. That's not super useful for geographic analyses, so it's lucky that the data set also includes zip codes and cities in most cases, as well as county records. The county assignments, we actually did a bunch of manual cleaning of those for a few different reasons. I'm happy to talk about the details if you like. It's also documented in the FAQs for the Losing Ground tool on our website. But here we're just looking by county at the percentage of SRL properties that were mitigated. So if there were 5 properties on that, if there were 10 properties on the SRL list, 5 of them have been mitigated, you get a 50% score in a medium blue color. Of course, however, it turns out that a lot of counties that have severe repetitive loss properties have only ever had 1 or 2. And that means that a map like this, just based on the straight up percentage without being normalized at all, isn't really comparing apples to oranges. So if we clean up a little bit of the noise and look only at counties that have more than 10 severe repetitive loss properties, first of all, we really see a sign of how concentrated these properties are in honestly just a handful of counties compared to all of the counties in the US. We also see how mitigation percentages tend to be higher, say along the sort of central Gulf Coast, the middle upper Mississippi. There's a few regions with a lot of really dark blue standing out compared to, say, Eastern Pennsylvania, which isn't quite as high in terms of its mitigation percentages. Again, probably not too surprising if we think about areas that have had large disasters, so large amounts of severe repetitive loss properties that then received large numbers of mitigation dollars long enough ago that the mitigation actions will have been recorded in this data set. And, this is all interesting, at least I think so. I hope you find this interesting as well, but this is all pretty academic, right? This is just numbers and properties and dollars, and we're not really getting into the actual question, which is who is affected by this information? Who are the people who live in these properties? Who are the communities that are experiencing severe and repetitive flooding? So there's lots of opportunities to compare this data with different types of socioeconomic or demographic indicators to get at the human impact of the story. This is just an example I'm going to walk you through really quick. Just an example of what you might be able to do with this data set. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. It's a formula that just takes into account factors like income, housing, language, access to transportation, things like that, to get an overall view of factors in an area that affect the overall health of a community and its vulnerability to negative impacts during a disaster. So counties in this case are assigned a numerical value. They're sort of stacked up and ranked against all of the other counties in terms of these vulnerability factors. It goes from 0, lowest vulnerability, to 1, highest vulnerability. The high vulnerability areas on this map are shown in dark blue. This is just from the CDC's website. I'm sure you can see areas in these dark blue zones that experience high flood risk, and that we saw on the previous maps that do have large concentrations of severe repetitive loss properties. So for the next few slides, I just want to show you some very basic back of the envelope calculations. This isn't intended to be, a robust statistical analysis of any kind, just an example or a sort of teaser to show you the flavor of the kinds of analyses that you could do with this data set. So here we have the mitigation percentages of severe repetitive loss properties in counties based on their social vulnerability index. That's a mouthful, but we're looking at 4 sort of buckets of counties, ones with the lowest vulnerability on the left, the ones with the highest vulnerability on the right, and then 2 categories in the middle. The dark blue are the non-mitigated SRL properties, gray mitigated, and the mitigation percent is indicated there on the chart. You might have your attention drawn to the sort of middle high, the third from the left bucket here. That's actually largely driven by Harris County, which has the most severe repetitive loss properties of any county in the nation and has a social vulnerability index value of about 0.7. So a lot of the large number of SRL properties there is actually accounted for by Harris County, Texas alone. So one thing that caught my interest when I was looking at this is that, so the national average of mitigation is about 27, 28%, something like that. But the counties with the highest social vulnerability index values over on the right actually have a higher percentage of mitigation compared to counties in other categories. So I thought, let's take a little bit of a closer look at that. We can split up the mitigated properties into their respective categories of acquisition, demolition, elevation, et cetera. If we simplify this and just look at the mitigated SRLs in the highest and lowest social vulnerability categories, it actually turns out that maybe there's not so much more mitigation going on in these high vulnerability counties anyway. If we look at these 2 charts, 2 bars, most of the difference is made up by the demolition without acquisition category. That's the one where someone's home may be gone, although they didn't even get a buyout, and the other category at the top, which could include properties that we actually don't know what, if anything, has been done to them. So this might be sparking some questions for you or some research ideas where you might want to go in and look specifically at certain counties or certain regions of the US and see whether there are other trends in mitigation rates, severe repetitive loss properties, social vulnerability, or other factors. I do want to close out, though, by taking a step back and making sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that those mitigated properties that we were just looking at represent less than a third of all the severe repetitive loss properties in the data set overall. And that's, again, not a good track record. And you don't have to take my word for it. The Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General's office last year came out completely coincidentally. It was the same week as we launched our web tool with this report that says, in no uncertain terms, that we as a nation are providing neither equitable nor timely relief to residents of severe repetitive loss properties. And that is not a good sign, considering that if anyone should be getting relief, it should probably include the people who have endured 5, 10, or more years of damaging floods year after year in their homes and communities. And we also need to remember that relying on any kind of flood insurance data set like this, these are data sets that come from the National Flood Insurance Program. That means by definition, we're leaving out anyone who never had flood insurance. which we all know includes a very large number of people, many of whom also face ongoing and in many cases increasing flood risk. We know that low-income families in communities of color are often more likely to be exposed to flooding, but less likely to hold flood insurance. And also, they're less likely to be well served by disaster aid and hazard mitigation programs. So we are not only losing ground here in terms of mitigating repeatedly flooded homes, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. We are also falling farther and farther behind in terms of reducing vulnerability to the very people who are hit first and worst by the damaging effects of climate change. And so I want to make sure that we're not only looking at what's in this data set, but what's also not in that data set and what that means in terms of the information that we're using to inform policy decisions. That's, of course, a sobering thought, but it's an important one. And I know that it's an issue that many of you are working to address every day. And I hope that you'll find our data tool useful in that work. So as we close, I just want to point you to this area on our website here, the URL again at the bottom of the screen. If you go to the highlighted area on the right-hand side of the page, you can click that download button and get a spreadsheet file with the full data set that we received from FEMA, a little bit about our methodology and the data tool and the FAQs document above it. So please feel free. I encourage you to use this data set to conduct your own analyses. If you use it for something cool, I'd love to hear about it. You can contact me at the email address or social media handle on this page. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thanks for that. I had to resist the urge to go check out the tool while you were talking. I'm going to do that afterwards. We have a couple of questions for you. The first one is there any way to know whether these properties might be covered by private insurance?
That's a great question. The short answer is no. There's not a way to know that. There are certain circumstances where we can be pretty sure that they're not. For example, not all states have private flood insurance, but in general, no. And this is something that is a big data gap and is something that NRDC is working to correct through our advocacy at the federal level. We think that there should be increased transparency, not just from the National Flood Insurance Program, but also from private insurers. And there should be transparency also between and data sharing between those two groups, so that it's not just that private insurers get to take advantage of the National Flood Insurance Program's data, but also vice versa, so that we can have as communities and also just as members of the public and homeowners and renters a better understanding of what's going on in our communities.
Yeah, for sure. The next question is, what interventions could help owners of properties who cannot afford flood insurance and therefore are unable to get on the SRL list at all due to a lack of claims?
Yeah, another great question. And this ties into what I was talking about at the end of my presentation, is that so much of our policy making and mitigation priorities and things like that are based on data from the flood insurance program. And so what's happening to people who are not even in that program, they're getting totally left behind. One thing that I think is critical here is thinking about how we prioritize and award federal mitigation dollars. For example, in the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, you get a great cost share if you're mitigating repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss properties. But of course, that is a program that is meant to benefit the flood insurance program financially, right? That's its goal. And so if you're not in the flood insurance program, right, you're sort of outside the scope of that program. And I think that through our federal mitigation programs, we need to be thinking about access, not just in terms of which communities have access to the sort of capacity and resources to apply for funding, but also which residents of those communities can benefit from the projects. And of course, the sad truth is that a lot of people are being left behind.
All right, so the next one is, do you have thoughts on how we might take this kind of analysis to another level where we can focus on mitigation of repetitive loss areas, including those that aren't designated necessarily as SRLs?
Yeah, so this data set just captures the severe repetitive loss properties, so sort of the, the floodiest of the flooded properties. But yes, it would be fascinating to also include the sort of standard repetitive loss list. You can look at which properties, for example, are repetitive loss now, but are in danger of becoming severe repetitive loss, or even taking another step back and looking generally at the claims data from the flood insurance program and look at which properties are at risk of becoming rep loss in the first place. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yes, that would be great. I would love to see that. If someone does it, let me know.
So then the next question, which I think is really interesting, right, is like data has a certain lifespan. So do you know the current date of that data that's in your tool right now, kind of what it was through? And then are you, do you guys have plans to maintain that data list, on an annual basis or otherwise?
Yes, great question. So the data in the tool currently has the severe repetitive loss list as of the 1st of June, 2018. So it is already a little bit out of date, 2 years. This is the second batch of severe repetitive loss data that we've received from FEMA. Our initial FOIA request actually got the data set as of 2015, and then we received an update a couple of years later for the 2018 list. We're trying to get an updated version so that we can do another refresh now, and we do plan to keep the tool up to date depending on the information that we get from FEMA.
So another data question, and similar to when we were having a talk on before the session began, how good or bad was the NFIP database in terms of data cleanliness? How much data cleaning did you have to do to increase the accuracy to prepare it for visualization?
The main data cleaning that we did was in terms of the locations of the properties. I mentioned this briefly in the presentation. The way that properties are assigned locations in the data set, since we don't have the specific addresses or coordinates of the properties, we sort of had to take a look at the other types of geographic information that are assigned to each record and make a decision of where they're actually located in order to accurately assign them to a county, which is the sort of geographic scale that we're using in the tool. And so we quickly found that the way that the county assignment seemed to be done in the data set was that it was based on the NFIP participating community. As most of you, I'm sure, know, there are plenty of NFIP participating communities that span counties. And so, for example, we were finding records in the city of Charleston that were assigned Berkeley County, South Carolina, when most of the city of Charleston is in Charleston County, South Carolina. And in fact, almost all of the flood-prone properties in the city of Charleston are within Charleston rather than Berkeley County. So we used a combination of the zip code and the city and sort of general knowledge about flood patterns in the area to make these county assignments. And so you can read a little bit about that in the FAQs. But that's one example of how this data set is pretty messy. It's based on individual people filling out that form in a lot of cases. And it's great that it's been collected and digitized, but we have a long way to go in terms of really ensuring accuracy in these kinds of records.
Yeah, for sure. The next question is, have you seen places in the research that you've done that have, they said, shunned FEMA funding and done mitigation on their own with their own dollars?
Yeah, absolutely. So Charlotte, North Carolina is a great example that lots of folks point to, where they have done, they started off doing a lot of acquisitions with federal funding got basically fed up with using federal grants for reasons that I'm sure we all understand, and instituted a fee system that pays into a rainy day fund that then they can use their own money in order to pay for acquisitions. And it means that they can do it a lot faster than relying on federal grants. And it also means that they can be more responsive to local priorities. For example, not all of the flood-prone properties in their area are necessarily within certain floodplain designations. You know, they understand the sort of geographic and demographic characteristics of their local area, you know, of course, better than anyone else. And so they're able to tailor their programs specifically to those needs.
Great. Well, that is all of our questions. So thank you so much. And we'll go to our last presentation now from Matt Fuchs from the Pew Charitable Trusts. And he's going to take us back to acquisitions and talk about policies to help communities benefit from buyouts, partnerships, valuing multiple benefits, and other key strategies. So Matt leads research and disaster mitigation efforts for the Pew Charitable Trust's Flood Prepared Communities Initiative, which aims to reform flood and disaster policy to better prepare people and property for future flooding. In his research role, he's analyzed public school flood risk, developed recommendations for improving buyouts of flood-prone properties, and designed a menu of policy options for communities looking to become more resilient to floods. His focus at Pew also includes working with bipartisan members of Congress to advance policy solutions and build support for innovative financing mechanisms to fund mitigation activities. He holds a bachelor's degree from Johns Hopkins and a Juris Doctor from the University of Maryland School of Law. So here we go with our final presentation. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Matt Fuchs, an officer with the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you to ASFPM for the opportunity to be speaking with you today. Pew is an international nonprofit that uses evidence-based, nonpartisan analysis to solve today's policy challenges, and our Flood Prepared Communities initiative focuses on reducing the economic and environmental impacts of flooding through reform in 4 areas: national flood insurance, resilient infrastructure, pre-disaster mitigation, and nature-based solutions. Americans are at risk from natural disasters no matter where they live. In 2020 alone, there were $22 billion natural disasters, including hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, drought, and flooding. 2019 was another historic year for billion-dollar weather and climate-related disasters, with costs estimated at $45 billion. And of that, costs for flooding were $20 billion. And the risk is increasing. When Hurricane Andrew hit Florida in 1992, it caused $26.5 billion in total economic damages. The same event today, with more people and value at risk, would be 80 to 100 billion. And yet, according to a Brookings report released last month, there is currently a 7-to-1 ratio of disaster recovery to resilience funding across federal government. We think that federal programs, and in particular buyouts, can help communities overcome their largest hurdles to implementing mitigation projects. So I'm going to talk about some recent developments for better flood readiness at the federal level, and then look forward to some opportunities in the offing for the rest of 2021. Despite significant partisanship in Congress, there have been a number of significant disaster resilience policies that have made it across the finish line. And then I'm also going to talk about a forthcoming report we have in the works at Pew, a bit of a teaser on our recommendations for improving buyouts at the federal level. It's a report that will be coming out this summer. So, driven by the devastation from the 2017 hurricane season, Congress appropriated $12 billion in community development block grant funds for mitigation activities, followed by HUD adding nearly $4 billion in additional funds, which brought the full pot close to $16 billion To date, this has been by far the largest allocation of funding toward disaster mitigation program in history. The goal of the program includes things like supporting data-informed investments, focusing mitigation efforts on repeatedly flooded homes and critical infrastructure, as well as building capacity to conduct comprehensive risk assessments for informing hazard mitigation plans. Incremental progress is still being made with the program to get plans in place, money out the door, and projects off the ground. There have been a number of deadlines for action plans from the 15 grantees, including localities, states, and territories over the last year, and HUD funding and requirement notices continue to roll out. The most recent, I believe, was in early January of this year. There's also the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that became law in 2018, giving a facelift to how the nation deals with disasters before and after they strike. A significant provision of this, as you may be aware, is the creation of a sustainable source of pre-disaster mitigation funding through the new Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, known as BRIC, that replaced FEMA's old PDM program. What we really see as the major improvement there was creating more consistent and sustainable source of pre-disaster mitigation funding, as opposed to relying on annual appropriations from Congress. And this one might have flown under the radar for some, but there was a significant flood standard measure included in the National Defense Authorization Act of FY 2019. Specifically, the bill directs the Department of Defense to update its project planning processes to disclose whether a proposed facility or infrastructure is within the 100-year flood plan. And if it is, develop a mitigation plan that either accounts for expected future flood risk through its design life or includes an additional margin of safety through assuming certain flood heights. And lastly, and most recently, the Safeguarding Tomorrow Through Ongoing Risk Mitigation, or STORM Act, was signed into law right at the end of last year. The bill authorizes the appropriation of $300 million for FEMA to make grants to capitalize revolving funds administered by the states. State agencies would then use those funds to make low interest loans to local governments to finance projects designed to mitigate damage from a range of future disasters. And our initiative at Pew has long supported passage of a state revolving loan fund at FEMA that would focus on flood mitigation. We think that the revolving loan fund is a strong concept that should be supported and funded at good, significant levels that can really make a difference. In the case of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, a federal investment of $48 billion has turned into $126 billion in clean water projects since 1987. It's promising to consider how much we could reduce risk for communities if we had that kind of money available and flowing as just one tool in the toolbox for the purpose of flood mitigation. We have a range of materials on revolving loan funds that could be supported through FEMA. This graphic shows how the process could work, very much modeled after the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund. And over the past couple of years, we have garnered support from a number of organizations, both at the national level and across the country. The concept is supported by more than 130 national and local groups. And more on this policy that I'll get into when I talk about some interesting developments forthcoming in 2021. So in addition to the important flood-ready developments on the federal level in recent years, there may actually be even more potential this year. The way that I'll talk about this is kind of split between standalone legislation and packages of legislation that we're seeing coming down the pipe. So as far as standalone legislation, first, there are a number of standalone bipartisan bills, some just recently introduced, that could be really critical. Similar to provisions in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, this bill would ensure all federally funded projects account for future risk through their design life. It would achieve this by improving the existing flood review that agencies already must undertake when evaluating whether to spend taxpayer dollars, and require the use of the best available data to account for future flood risk in project planning and design. And in cases where the data is lacking, they'd have to include a margin of safety by assuming flood heights 2 to 3 feet above base flood elevation. Another bill to watch for is the Repeatedly Flooded Communities Preparation Act of 2021, which would require communities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program that exceed a certain threshold of repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss structures to work with FEMA to perform community risk assessments and develop and implement community-specific plans to mitigate the number of those repetitive loss structures. And another significant bill that's expected to be introduced soon is the Building for Future Disasters Act, which would essentially end NFIP subsidies for newly constructed properties built during or after the year 2025 that are later mapped into flood zones. That is, those properties would be subject to rates that reflect up-to-date flood risk and not qualify for a subsidy. As far as broader packages, other opportunities are in the offing. Another challenge is determining who would be eligible for these packages. But in the case of NFIP reform, in addition to the bill I mentioned before, a lot will need to be done through a broad package, hopefully modernizing the program. After being extended for a 17th consecutive time last year, the program is now set to expire at the end of September. So we're curious, will Congress finally be up to the task of tackling comprehensive reform on NFIP? There is the Flood Mitigation State Revolving Loan Fund Act that I referenced before, based on the concept from the Storm Act. And provisions have been included in previous NFIP packages that would create a national requirement around disclosure of flood risk for prospective buyers and renters to help them make informed decisions. And then another example of legislation that we are watching is President Biden's American Jobs Plan. Resilience is mentioned throughout, and there's a Make Our Infrastructure More Resilient section that calls for $50 billion in investments that includes building back above existing codes and standards, and highlights programs like BRIC, CDBG, new DOT initiatives, and transition and relocation assistance. There is also mention of investing $621 billion in transportation infrastructure and resilience within the section on transforming our crumbling transportation infrastructure. And then there is the highway bill reauthorization, the last legislative package that I'll cover. It's one that I think has the most potential for bipartisan support of any comprehensive flood-ready policy opportunity this year. This past Congress, the House passed a historically large infrastructure package that included the highway bill as its base foundation. In the Senate, the Environment and Public Works Committee unanimously passed a highway bill out of committee that included an unprecedented amount of disaster resilience and mitigation measures and funding. So now I'll switch gears a bit to our research at Pew. We have a report coming out this summer with recommendations for improving buyout policies at the federal level. So we decided, just sort of as a threshold decision, to focus on the federal level. In most instances, the federal government does not itself purchase properties, and neither HUD nor FEMA have standing programs aimed specifically at supporting buyouts. Nevertheless, those agencies provide the lion's share of financial support for buyouts, and there's much they could do to improve and increase the use of buyouts as part of a comprehensive approach to flood mitigation. I want to talk a little bit just about the methodology, how we went about researching this report. We went through kind of four main areas. The first was a landscape review of policies and programs that offer or somehow influence property acquisitions or buyouts. This included looking at special reports, legislation, research, and analyzing the detailed mechanisms of buyout programs across federal agencies. Now, as part of that review, the study team looked at challenges, both institutional and sociocultural, that present obstacles in some ways for effective buyouts. Now, based on the review, the second phase was to focus on case studies of communities, including interviews with practitioners, looking at both success stories as well as examples that show the barriers to more successful buyout programs. And then the third piece was actually a virtual expert workshop, bringing together academics, subject matter experts, and a number of local and state practitioners. Over 3 days of sessions, the workshop explored new ideas and strategic approaches for buyouts. This workshop conversation was informed by the landscape review and case studies. And then finally, the study team focused on synthesizing information and developing this report with recommendations that will be useful for improving federal buyout programs and policies. And that synthesis is still ongoing. As I mentioned, it'll be wrapping up in the summer. I include this graphic here just to document the length and complexity of a buyout project. That's one of our findings, is that the process is extremely complicated for individuals and local officials to navigate. This is basically a language from a HUD chart. There are 6 steps involved, but as you can see, there are many steps within those broader steps. And so we will be thinking through recommendations for making that interface between state and local level and the federal policies and programs smoother and more actionable, meaningful, translating into more buyouts and more resilient communities. And another one to highlight the complexity is this flowchart that NRDC created, just borrowing it here again to show that it is not easy to create a process chart for buyouts because there is so much complexity involved in the process. Our report will cover 2 main sections. One will be about federal funding sources and guidelines. Another will be how the federal government can support better planning for buyouts before disasters strike, but also buyouts after disasters when communities are trying to get back on their feet. How can they anticipate that situation, and how can the federal government help them anticipate and plan so that they can be ready to implement more buyout projects across communities in that post-disaster phase as well. One example of a recommendation that we'll be making in this report is that the federal government should better support community-led efforts to integrate buyout needs into broader plans for disaster recovery, community capital improvement, and watershed management plans. Another example is that federal agencies should better integrate tools to help communities evaluate social vulnerabilities and address critical social service needs. And a third recommendation that we will be proposing in our report is on FEMA's benefit cost analysis. Our sense is that the ongoing programs that have incorporated community input and set additional goals of environmental protection or enhancement and social equity considerations should be given additional flexibility regarding demonstration of effectiveness for the BCA. And that's my presentation. I know it was a lot to digest. I'm not sure if we have time for questions following this presentation, but if we don't, I'm very happy to continue this conversation offline. You got my email address there. If you would like to reach out to me, please send me a message. Thanks again to ASFPM and to all of you.
Great, thanks, Matt, for that. We look forward to seeing that report later this year. So we have one question for you so far, but I'm sure others will roll in as we get talking, and Laura and Anna are still here as well. So if you have questions for them, please feel free to put those in the chat. But Matt, first, a question: how do you feel about what Realtor.com has done to step up and integrate the flood factor into their online listing platform?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, we certainly support the private sector and the real estate industry putting an emphasis on flood risk and highlighting those risks for prospective buyers of properties, and everything really that stakeholders can do to raise awareness about flood risk is welcome, while noting the importance of factoring in the most accurate data. I think that that's the critical piece, and there are a lot of different ways of slicing the data, and you know, we're really excited about working with groups that are raising awareness about flood risk in the real estate industry and elsewhere to make sure that the best approaches are taken.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that with a lot of different flood factors coming out this year and ways of assessing that risk. So another question that's come through is, what recommendations are you planning to make with respect to social equity / vulnerability and the benefit cost analysis? I know that that has been a theme throughout this conference, is the BCA, everyone's favorite thing to do, and the impact that it has in terms of equity.
Yeah, I think that that's going to be a real area of focus for the report. We are really hopeful that and expect that FEMA's BRIC program for reducing the risk of disasters will you know, really focus on a requirement for projects to be cost effective, to ensure in a way that ensures that it's not disadvantaging under-resourced communities, which really do need buyouts the most. And we also think that FEMA should potentially give more funding to state and local applications that prioritize buyouts for vulnerable populations. You know, the devil's really going to be in the details for how that works exactly. We think it's important for FEMA to use CDC's social vulnerability index to inform its decisions on which flood risk maps should be updated in support of the NFIP, and we think grant criteria across the board, you know, not just FEMA, but the other federal departments and agencies that are in this space should make socially vulnerable applicants a priority. And the last thing I would say is just sort of maybe an open-ended point about the importance of collaborating across the federal government to ensure that we're bringing to bear the most effective mechanisms for putting resources to buyouts in general, but particularly, you know, the demographics that need them the most, you know, the low-income geographic areas.
So the next one is, are you guys considering, is there any thought to providing incentives to the communities, not just the buyouts of the building owner, because some communities are hesitant due to the long-term economic impacts?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of creative ideas being explored for how to aggregate, you know, buyouts in ways that are going to reduce the, the it's cliche at this point, but the Swiss cheese effect, and to make buyouts more affordable at the individual level, the more that those types of projects can be aggregated, sort of spreading the resources across the individuals is a really smart approach that should be explored. And so I don't want to say too much because our report is going to be released this summer, and we will have some more specifics along those lines in the report. So I guess I would ask to stay tuned until hopefully around the July timeframe when that report will be released.
And like you said, this is a teaser, so you can't give it all away right now. Another question, I keep receiving phone calls that tell me I'm pre-approved for a mortgage. What obstacles are there to prevent a program where certain properties are pre-approved for a buyout? I thought that was a really interesting question.
Yeah, no, it's certainly something that we want to figure out how the federal government can bring technical expertise to or more technical expertise, or streamlining that technical expertise and coordinating it across the federal government to help states and localities with planning efforts, which could include sort of that pre-approved approach to buyouts, which could really expedite the implementation of those projects on the ground following disasters, when the appetite for those buyouts really does go up. So I think there is, again, a lot of creativity to be brought to bear on that issue. There are some states like Ohio that have been shown a track record of experimenting with pre-approving buyouts in their planning processes that we think is really effective, and could be modeled by other states. But this report will be focused on federal recommendations, but there will be case studies in the report that focus on states and localities. There are some specific experiences with buyouts that could be particularly instructive, but in the context of working with federal programs. And I would also put in a quick plug for a previous Pew research project called Mitigation Matters that explored 13 case studies of states and localities that are doing really interesting things with mitigation, and specifically in a couple of cases with buyouts. And I think Wisconsin and Iowa and probably a couple of others of those case studies are interesting, relatively recent looks at what states and localities are, how they're experimenting with interesting approaches to buyouts at the local level.
Here, it's a great report. So unfortunately, we are done. There are several more questions in the chat, but we don't have time to answer them. And unlike in a real conference where we can kind of keep everybody, I'm getting it's time to wrap it up. So really appreciate all three presenters today, the great presentations, and the very engaged audience participation with all the questions. Appreciate it so much, and hope everybody enjoys. I think there's one more session of the day and of the conference. So go enjoy it. Thanks.